Hi everybody and welcome to Cellular Respiration. So we've learned about cells, we've learned about the types of different cells, we've learned about what's going on inside of each of these cells. Now we're going to actually be talking about, like energy processing. So if you remember early on our first lecture, when we're talking about what it needs to be, what it means to be alive, one of the 7 stipulations was energy processing. So that's what we're going to be talking about today and on the next lecture as well. So this type of energy processing is done by all organisms, including plants. So we usually think of plants as just doing photosynthesis, but they actually do photosynthesis to build the sugars they need. Then they do cellular respiration to break down those sugars into usable bits of energy. Just like we learned about last lecture when we were talking about that ATP, we need that ATP to actually be cellular energy for our cells. So that's how we're going to get it. We're going to get it through cellular respiration. We're basically just taking these big food molecules and we're breaking them down into usable bits of energy. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. All organisms on the entire planet do it. And I hate to say it, but the next 2 lectures are going to be kind of difficult ones. So cellular respiration and photosynthesis are not easy subjects, guys. Don't just try to memorize this real quick the night before the exam. It's not going to work. This is complicated stuff. So please, 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 usually in class I would repeat myself over and over and over and over again, but because you guys have this recorded lecture, you can just play this video over and over and over again to kind of solidify the information. And yes, you will have some in-class work at the end of this video, so make sure you watch it all the way through. Just like always, this is like being in class, and therefore you're still responsible for the material. So let's talk about cellular respiration. Okay, so again, these cellular respiration and photosynthesis are all energy processes, right? We're trying to process our energy. We're trying to get our energy to our cells. So the way we can do this is, again, if you're an animal cell, you have to actually consume your own nutrients. We are not plants. We don't go through photosynthesis, and therefore we do not make our own sugars. We actually have to ingest our sugars. Okay, well, and I say sugars as this is just like a general example of where we get energy, because remember, carbohydrates are a great source of energy. Right, so are proteins, so are lipids, but I'm just using carbohydrates as examples to get our sugars. So things like plants and other photosynthetic organisms, right, are autotrophs, meaning self-feeders. Auto meaning self and troph meaning kind of food, right? So self-feeders. We are heterotrophs, meaning hetero meaning different feeders. We need to get our nutrients from other places. And that's what cellular respiration is all about. Okay, breaking down these larger food molecules into usable bits of energy like ATP. Now, I did mention that plants need to go through cellular respiration. Yes, this is something that people always forget about. They think, no, they just go through photosynthesis. That's how they get the sugars and the nutrients, right? Then they have to still break those down turn them into cellular energy. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is that cellular energy, hence cellular respiration. Now, you hear the term respiration and you're automatically thinking, well, you should be, right? Breathing. And it's not really anything to do with cell breathing, but it does have to do with oxygen. And that's the important part. Cellular respiration can only happen if there's oxygen present. So that's hence that respiration part of it. But really all it is creating energy. And we don't create energy. Remember that energy is never created nor destroyed. It's just transferred. So all we're doing is transferring it from that cheeseburger into cellular energy that our cells can actually use, because our cells are keeping us alive, right? My muscles right now are moving because my cells are moving. Excuse me. So very important to get energy to all the cells in your body. Now, this diagram right here shows both cellular respiration happening and photosynthesis happening, and it's showing it in a loop. And that's because they're related, okay? They're interrelated. Really what's happening, and we'll start off with cellular respiration because that's what's going on first. With the use of oxygen, we take big molecules of, food that we've just eaten, and in our mitochondria, we break them down and turn them into ATP and water. Now, plants, when they go through photosynthesis, and this is what we're going to learn about in the next lecture, plants take CO2 and water, and then their chloroplast turn it into sugars. Wait, what? We took the sugars, in this case this is glucose, C6H12O6, that's just glucose. Okay, we take sugar and oxygen, and in our mitochondria, we turn it into water and CO2. The plants take water and CO2, and in their chloroplast, turn it into sugars and oxygen, which we then take in our mitochondria, turn it into CO2 and water, which they take, and in their chloroplast turn into sugar and oxygen, which then we take. Are you seeing the pattern here? Right? This is that cycle. This is why things like plants are so important in the environment, because they take up this nasty CO2 that we produce as a byproduct of cellular respiration, and they use it and they turn it into oxygen, a nasty byproduct that they don't like, but we love. Wait, we need sugar and oxygen, and they make sugar and oxygen, but we make water and CO2, and they need water and CO2. So again, these are interchangeable, well, not interchangeable, but interrelated topics that are very much, coinciding with each other. They're working together in this cycle. This is an energy cycle. Okay, it's moved along, right? Say that sugar that is stored in that tree or that plant gets eaten by a cow. The cow goes through cellular respiration. They produce CO2 and water, which then gets absorbed by the plant, which then grows more grass, which then gets eaten by the cow, which then gets more, again, it's just very much a mutualistic relationship between us and these things like, plants and stuff, other photosynthetic organisms that are really, really important. So today we're going to be focusing just on the bottom half, so don't worry so much about this top half, this photosynthesis half. We're going to be focusing on this bottom half here, just the cellular respiration part today. But I'm going to focus on this in really great detail today, because if you really understand cellular respiration, photosynthesis really is just the opposite of that. It's just that in reverse. So if you get cellular respiration, you will understand photosynthesis so much easier. So make sure that you really pay attention to this lecture, as all lectures, because they're all important. But this one's really important for the next 2 parts, because if you really get it, then later on it will be easier for you guys. So let's get into that. Remember cellular respiration, that whole respiration part is just because we need oxygen. Okay, our cells need oxygen. You're like, why? My cells don't have lungs? You're right, your cells don't have lungs, and they don't need them, but they do need the oxygen, because the oxygen is going to help start that chemical reaction that is cellular respiration. And we're producing energy. That's the whole point. So even though it says respiration in the net, it really has nothing to do with your lungs. It just means that oxygen must be present for cellular respiration to happen. And that's what we can see right here. We breathe in O2, we do cellular respiration in our cells. The byproduct of that, or meaning what's produced afterwards, is this nasty little thing called CO2. We don't want it, so then we expel it out of our lungs. So when you breathe in, you're getting the oxygen to all of your cells. When you breathe out, you're releasing that CO2 that is created because of the cellular respiration in each one of your cells. That's why you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out CO2. Hence the respiration part. Now, here's the chemical formula for cellular respiration. Do you need to know it? Yes. Yes, you do. Okay? So, we have glucose, right? C6H12O6. If you just remember it as glucose, that's fine. You don't actually have to remember the chemical formula. That's okay. You have glucose. And again, this is kind of like the big broad picture. You don't actually need to know how many of each of these we have, but you need to know that glucose plus oxygen, these little arrows represent a chemical reaction happening. So these are the reactants. Remember, we learned about those, the ones that are going to react. And these are the products, the ones that are formed. So in this case, it says glucose plus oxygen gives us, chemical reaction, gives us carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Specifically, 1 glucose gives us 6 oxygen, one glucose plus 6 oxygen gives us 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water, and ATP. Okay? Do you guys need to know every single one of these? No. But do you need to know the overall chemical formula? Absolutely. So make sure you know that. Glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide, water, and energy. That is the chemical formula, or the chemical reaction, or chemical equation. All those are pretty much synonymous for cellular respiration. So make sure you know it. Spoiler alert. Remember I told you photosynthesis is just cellular respiration backwards. Guess what? Sunlight plus water plus CO2 gives you, after photosynthesis, oxygen and sugar and glucose. So if you learn it once, all you gotta do is flip it, and you got it for both of them, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And yes, you will need to know absolutely both of those, so make sure that you guys are paying attention to those. Now, cellular respiration, right? Most people think plants are just doing photosynthesis. They're not. Every living thing in the entire planet goes through cellular respiration. Every single one. Right? From the simple tiny bacteria to animals to plants. We all do it. We're breaking down some kind of nutrients and we're turning it into usable bits of cellular energy. That's why we all need to consume things. Even bacteria, they're consuming things. So they need to get nutrients from outside sources. Even plants, they make their own nutrients, but then they still have to break them down into cellular energy, useful bits of cellular energy. And that's the difference. Now, here's where we're going to get a little complicated. I'm going to zoom this in a little bit. Okay, now that I'm zoomed in a little bit, we can see this hopefully a little bit better. Now, you will need to know the steps of cellular respiration. You will also need to know exactly where each of these steps are occurring. Okay, so let me just orient you to this picture real quick. So here we are inside the cell. So this is an animal cell right here. This is a plant cell right here. Remember, round, squishy animal cell, some kind of geometric angle, that's going to be a plant cell. Now, this blue stuff is known as the cytoplasm. Remember, the cytoplasm is just the liquidy, gooey part that all of the organelles are bathed in. It's just essentially kind of like water, like the interior of the cell. It's just kind of water. That's the cytoplasm. Now, inside the cytoplasm is step 1, and step 1 is called glycolysis. So, step 1 occurs out here in the cytoplasm, also known as the cytosol, same thing. But in here, steps 2 and 3, well, really steps 2, 3, and 4, all occur in the mitochondria. Remember the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. This is because it creates all of that ATP that we need, all this usable bits of energy. Here's how it does it. And these steps are really important, so make sure that you guys are paying attention to these. And yes, you will need to write out these steps. So it's really just important just to kind of, as you're watching this video, just write out the steps, because I'm going to repeat it again and again and again. And luckily for you guys, you have the video, so you can just, repeat this. So, step 1, glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, okay? So we're out here in the cytoplasm of the cell, meaning just the liquidy part of the cell. Glycolysis is the cutting up of glucose. So remember, lysis means to cut or to burst or to break. Glyco is just glucose, okay? So in this case, we're breaking up simple sugars. So we're taking glucose, we're chopping it up, and we're turning it into 2 pyruvic acids. So again, step 1, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Takes 1 glucose molecule, turns it into 2 pyruvic acids, and 2 ATP. Okay, so you do need to know the products that are formed in each one of the steps. I'm going to repeat this again and again and again, so you're going to get this, trust me. So, step 1, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Takes 1 glucose molecule, turns it into 2 pyruvic acids, and produces a little bit of ATP. In this case, it produces 2 ATP. Now, I do have to say this is a net gain of 2 ATP because it really produces 4 ATP, but to get glycolysis started, it takes 2 ATP. So if it takes 2 but makes 4, really it only makes 2. Like your product, what you really get out of it is only 2. So again, step 1, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, takes 1 glucose molecule, turns it into 2 pyruvic acids, and 2 ATP. Now, if you watch other videos online, they are going to give you sometimes slightly different answers for some of these other steps, especially the electron transport chain. Some will say that it produces 28, some will say it produces 34. We're just going to go for a simple number here, so what I say in this video is going to be the numbers that we're going to go with. Like I said, they actually range from 24 to about 36, or sorry, 28 to about 36, but it depends on the type of cell, it depends on the efficiency of the cell, it depends on a lot of things. So, and scientists are still learning about all this, so we're going to go with our number, which is going to be 32 total. 32 total? Yeah, 32 total. Makes 32 ATP. Okay? So the first 2 are made here in glycolysis, so we already have 2 ATP made. All right. So let me click on to this one right here. Now, this looks scary. This is not a scary diagram. I'm going to walk you guys through it. So, this is exactly what I said just happened. We are still step 1, glycolysis. This is occurring in the cytoplasm. We take 1 glucose molecule. Now, a glucose molecule is essentially a chain of 6 carbons. So that's what we see right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. Okay? Now, with the help of a little ATP, remember it takes 2 ATP to get glycolysis started. That's all. Little bit of energy, we're going to take this glucose molecule, we're going to break it up. Now, here we're adding phosphates to it. That's what these little P's are. We add phosphates to it. We break phosphate bonds. We're adding bonds. We're breaking bonds. You don't need to know every single step of this. You just need to know the big picture stuff. The input, what goes into this, 1 glucose molecule. What comes out of it? 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATP. Okay? So for each one of these that gets made, so we essentially chop this glucose molecule in half, right? 3 of the carbon go up here. They get the phosphates added onto them, onto ends. Then they get the phosphates broken off of them. Again, don't need to worry about all of that. But when we're breaking and making these bonds, essentially some electrons get left behind. Okay? So when these electrons get left behind, they get picked up by what's called energy carriers or high energy carriers, or even high energy electron carriers. Okay, so these essentially are like those enzymes that we learned about. They pick up the molecule, they carry it, and they drop it off. That's all they're doing. In this case, they're picking up an electron, taking it where it needs to go, and dropping it off. So that's what you can see right here. So NAD plus is just like the enzyme, or ADP, until it picks up that extra electron, then it's going to become NADH. It's just a carrier. It's just taking electrons where they need to go. Okay, we don't know where they need to go yet. I'm gonna tell you later, don't worry. But right now we're just storing them. So imagine these electrons are little bits of storable energy, and the NADPH right here, the NADH is just picking it up and storing it temporarily. That's all you guys need to know. That's as much detail as you guys need to know about it. You just need to know step 1, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, takes 1 glucose molecule, makes 2 pyruvic acid, these little 3 carbon chains right here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Because we had 6 carbon, we just cut it right in half. Hence glycolysis, cutting glucose in half to form 2 pyruvic acids. And some NADHs, these high energy carriers, that's all. Okay, so in glycolysis, we took 1 glucose molecule, we made 2 pyruvic acids, we made 2 ATP, and we made 2 NADHs. Remember, the NADHs are just storing those electrons for later use. Now we are going to actually enter the mitochondria. So before we were in the cytoplasm, right now we're actually going into, we're in the cytoplasm. Now we're actually going into the mitochondria. So this arrow represents now we're in this mitochondria right here. Okay, so that's what that shows right here. So now we take 2 pyruvic acids. This is step 2. So step 1, glycolysis, we take 1 glucose molecule, turns it into 2 pyruvic acids, a little bit of NADPH, a little bit of NADH, and a little bit of glucose. A little bit of ATP. I'm getting too fast now. I should slow down. Now, step 2. Step 2, we're in the mitochondria. We're taking those 2 pyruvic acids, we're making them into 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. That's what you see right here. Okay? We went from 2 pyruvic acids. Now, inside the mitochondria, we're making 2 acetyl-CoA molecules and 2 more NADHs. We're just storing those electrons for later. We're going through all these chemical reactions where we're making and breaking the bonds, and all those little electrons that are floating around, we're going to pick you up and store them for later. You're essentially like caching them aside. You're holding them for later use. So, step 2 is pretty easy, right? We take 2 pyruvic acid molecules, we turn them into 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, and 2 NADHs. This is the only step that doesn't make any ATP. This is like an intermediate step. Okay, it doesn't make any ATP, but it does make more of these NADHs, which we need for later. Okay, and that's what we're going to see right here. And again, this looks scarier than it actually is. All you're doing is you're taking the pyruvic acid, right? You're now you're kicking off another one of those carbons. In this case, you're forming some CO2 as your byproduct. This is where you, remember, inhale oxygen, exhale CO2. That's where you get the CO2 from, right? Because we took this pyruvic acid, we chopped it up even further, and now we have acetic acid and a CO2, or carbon dioxide. Okay, making and breaking these electrons, or these bonds again, we store a couple more electrons, so we have more NADPH now produced. And we add this enzyme called coenzyme A. It's just an enzyme, don't worry about it. And it's going to pick up this little acetic acid and it's going to take it where it needs to go. That's why the molecule in the end is called coenzyme A, because it has acetyl-CoA. Because it has the coenzyme A and the acetic acid. So acetic acid plus coenzyme A gives you acetyl-CoA. It's just an intermediate molecule. It's like a temporary step. We went from glucose to pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA, and we're going to keep going. Okay, so that's all you need to know. Don't worry about why this is. Now, I've only shown you this for one pyruvic acid, but remember in glycolysis we made 2. So really this step would happen twice and we would end up with 2 acetyl-CoAs. So that's exactly what we saw in this picture here, right? 1 glucose gives us 2 pyruvic acid, NADH, and ATP. Then that pyruvic acid turns into acetyl-CoA, right? And produces NADH and a little bit of CO2. Okay, so that's step 2. Moving on to step 3. Let me go back for a quick. So step 3, the acetyl-CoA gets dumped into the citric acid cycle. And it is a cycle because it keeps going. Keeps going and recycling and recycling and recycling some of the products. We're going to see a video on this later. So my animation, I don't have any animations obviously, and I can't really draw it on the board for you. So I'm going to show you guys a video, the crash course video. It will totally help you when it comes to this and photosynthesis later. Just the visualization is really important here. So you guys will get this. Don't worry, don't worry. So, step 3, citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle also is called the Krebs cycle. Yeah, let's name everything twice, scientists, because we like to confuse you. I'm sorry, but it's called both. Citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle, both are the same thing. So, we enter the citric acid cycle here. In this case, now we are going to produce 2 more ATP, right? We're going to produce 6 NADHs, that's a lot of electrons, and a cousin to NADH is FAD2. Same kind of thing. It's just one of those electron carriers. It just picks up the electron, takes it where it needs to go, drops it off. Just like the NADHs. So, we've stored 2 NADHs, plus 2 more NADHs, plus 6 now, and 2 FADHs. So we are just banking those electrons. We have a ton of electrons now. And that's good, because we're going to need them in step 4. Right? But we're still on step 3 right now, the citric acid cycle. So the citric acid cycle by far produces the most out of anything, right? 6 NADHs, 2 FADH2s, 2 ATPs, but that's still not all the energy. We still need to get more energy. So we need to keep turning, and keep turning to get to step 4. So here's how the citric acid cycle works. Remember that coenzyme A is just a carrier. It was taking acetic acid over here, and then it drops it off and goes, here, okay, bye. Right, so it drops it off here, enters the citric acid cycle. Essentially what happens is you have this little acceptor molecule that's a 4-carbon chain, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it picks up the acetic acid, becoming a 6-carbon chain right here. The 6-carbon chain in this case is known as citric acid, hence citric acid cycle, right? And then all it does is, again, as soon as it makes it, it breaks it. Right, so we're just making and breaking bonds again. All of these chemical reactions are happening. You don't need to know them. You just need to know the input and the output. For step 3, citric acid cycle, the input is acetic acid, right? And it's going to turn. All 3 of these are just like those enzymes. They're just waiting to pick up their products. They're just waiting by. They're standing by. After the end of the citric acid cycle, we now produce 2 CO2, so even more CO2 is produced. We produce ATP, we produce NADHs, and we produce FADH2. So both of these, again, are just high energy carriers. They're just picking up those electrons and taking them where it needs to go. This is our ATP, the whole point of all this, why we're doing this. And CO2 is a byproduct. Now remember, there's 2 CO2s here, 1 ATP, 3 NADHs, and 1 FADH2, but that's only for 1 acetic acid. Remember, we had 2. So you have to double all these numbers. That's why this chart right here is a little bit easier to understand, where we produce the 6 NADHs, the 2 FADH2s, and 2 ATP, and 4 CO2s. So this is kind of what it's like a summary table, summary picture of what's actually happening. So far we have 4 ATP that we have made. We have 6 CO2 that we have made. We have a bunch of, 10 NADHs. We have 2 FADH2s. We have all these electrons that we're just sitting there waiting to do something with, right? And we have 4 ATP. But that's not really what we want. We want a lot more ATP than that. And here's where all those electrons are going. We kept storing all those electrons. Why? Because they need to go to the electron transport chain, or the ETC. Okay, that ETC is where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. The most amount of energy that we want is going to come out of that electron transport chain. That's why each one of these steps is storing these extra electrons, because they're all going to go to the electron transport chain. Okay, that's why we've been storing them, for this exact reason. This is step 4. So again, it is called the electron transport chain because it is a chain. It is moving from one to the other to the other. It's kind of triggering these channel proteins that you can see right here in the inner mitochondrial membrane. So remember that mitochondria has two membranes. It has the inner membrane and the outer membrane because we're assuming that it was eaten by that endosymbiont. Remember the ancient eukaryote. So inside the innermost membrane is where the electron transport chain is here. So you can see all of these different channel proteins. And essentially what happens is we take all that energy stored in those extra electrons that we have and we create an artificial gradient. Remember when we talked about active transportation, right? We want to go the opposite direction. We want to go from a low concentration to a high concentration, which doesn't make any sense. We're going the opposite direction, right? This is why. So what we're going to do is we're actively going to essentially shove these hydrogen molecules the opposite direction, creating a higher concentration gradient here. These hydrogen ions don't like each other, and they're like, okay, I'm the same charge as you, I'm going to repel you, so they're pushing away from each other. As they push away from each other, they push their way through this guy. This guy is called ATP synthase, and anything synthase is to create. So ATP synthase creates ATP. Okay, so what this guy does is he allows all of these hydrogen molecules that have been shoved the wrong way via these channel proteins, he allows them to come back through. When he comes back through, when they come back through, they kind of force their way back through, they turn this ATP synthase. For every turn of the ATP synthase, you create ATP. Okay, so that's what it does. Is these electrons, basically the NADH and the FADH2, drop off their electrons here, right? These electrons move through the membrane, they move through these proteins, and they kind of lose energy as they go along. That's why it's a chain. They kind of go from this one to this one, this one. That's why you see this downward slope. It's losing a little bit of energy every time it goes, and that's because every time it goes from one to the other, it's actively pushing these hydrogen ions across the membrane. So that takes energy. That's where the energy goes. It pushes, triggers this one, then this one, then this one, which eventually creates this artificial gradient here, a higher concentration here, then down here. So these guys are like, I don't like this. I want to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So they shove their way through the ATP synthase, which turns it, which makes ATP. So the turning of the ATP synthase actually creates enough energy to put that phosphate on the ADP molecule, turning it into ATP. Okay, that adenosine or adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so this is the whole reason that we're doing this, is to make that ATP. And in fact, the electron transport chain makes the most ATP out of any step. It makes about 28. Plus the 4 we already made, we get a total of 32 ATP for every single glucose molecule that we have. And imagine, a starch is just a series of chain of lots of glucoses. So you get 32 ATP for every single glucose in that chain. You get a lot of ATP out of things like carbs. So, super important. Again, if that was a little bit confusing to you guys, I have a video, or you can just watch this one again. Please, there's a million different resources online. Now, this number, the 32, will vary depending on what website you go to. For our test, it will be 32. Okay? So that is the total amount of ATP that is made out of cellular respiration. Okay, so to sum it all up, we're going to go through all the 4 steps in just real quick and short form right here. So, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. You take one glucose molecule, you turn it into 2 pyruvic acids, 2 NADHs, and 2 ATP. Okay, those 2 pyruvic acid molecules will then enter the mitochondria, where they will get turned into 2 acetyl-CoA molecules, as well as 2 CO2 and 2 NADHs. That acetyl-CoA, the little acetic acid molecule, remember the coenzyme A just gets recycled. It's not actually part of the reaction. But it does pick up the acetic acid, takes it to the citric acid cycle. The acetic acid gets picked up by the acceptor molecule. It gets turned into the citric acid molecule, which then again, turn of this little cycle, produces 2 FAD2s, just energy carriers, 6 NADHs, again, just carrying those electrons, 4 more CO2, and 2 ATP. Still in the mitochondria, now we are going in the inner mitochondrial membrane to the electron transport chain, where all of these high energy carriers that we've been storing the electrons with, they carry them all to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain turns on this pump, then this pump, then this pump. It's a working chain where those electrons all get forced across the membrane. Those hydrogen ions get forced across the membrane, creating an artificial gradient. Creates an artificial gradient, which then forces their way through the ATP synthase, turning the ATP synthase, making that ATP a total of 28 ATP, for a total of 2, 4 plus 28 gives us 32 ATP. Woo! They usually like to say on tests that the final electron acceptor, where these electrons actually go after they're moved around, is oxygen. And that's actually what turns oxygen into water. So the very final step of the electron transport chain is turning that oxygen into the water. So we are done with that. That is all sorts of fun stuff. Yes, you need to know what happens in each one of those stages. Yes, you need to know what's coming in, what's being made, and where it's physically happening. So just rewatch this little section. But this picture, if you could explain this picture and you can memorize just this picture, you guys will be golden. Golden. Right? You don't need to know all those little tiny in-between details. This is not going to be that difficult. This is not going to be that in-depth. It's just going to be kind of bigger picture what's happening in each one of these stages. Now, where do we get all the energy for this? Does every single thing that we eat go to every single step? No, actually not. Now, most of the things that we're going to eat are going towards glycolysis. So you can see the green is going to be your carbohydrates, the orange is going to be your lipids, and the purple is going to be your proteins. So you can see all three of these macromolecules are used for glycolysis. And that's really important because some organisms don't bother going through cellular respiration. Some of us actually stop at just glycolysis. Say an organism that didn't have oxygen. You can't go through cellular respiration if you don't have oxygen. So they wouldn't be able to enter those cellular respiration stages, so they would just stick at glycolysis. And glycolysis does work. I mean, it makes 2 ATP. It's not quite enough ATP. But if you're a little tiny organism that doesn't necessarily need a lot of energy, then you'll probably be fine. Now, starting the actual transformation between the pyruvic acids and the acetyl-CoA are really only done by the lipids and the proteins. And finally, the citric acid cycle is only primarily started with the help of proteins. This is why it's so important to have a balanced diet. You don't want to cut out carbs, not all carbs. Even those low-carb diets, you still need carbs. Okay, you need them. You still need proteins. Even if you're a vegan and vegetarian and you don't eat meat, you still need to get your proteins from plants or beans or something like that because you still need the proteins. You're not going to get that citric acid cycle going unless you get a protein. So it's really important to have all of these things in our diet to actually help us go through cellular respiration in the most efficient way possible. Now, what happens when we don't have oxygen? Well, we do something called fermentation. So in the lack or, a low abundance of oxygen, your body and many other organisms are going to go through fermentation. Now, there's a couple different types of fermentation that we're going to learn about. Some are, I'd say, better than others, or at least more beneficial. But producing or going through fermentation produces a couple different things that we really need. Some of the things like cheese, yogurt, bread, sourdough breads, all that kind of stuff, they're all coming from fermentation. So there's also other products like wine that come from the fermentation of fruit. So we're going to learn about those real quick. But fermentation actually happens in lots of different of these small, tiny organisms when there's no oxygen present. So things like yeast, right? When you deny them oxygen, they actually just go through fermentation. And that's where we get things like ethyl alcohol, or what you should refer to as just alcohol. This is known as alcoholic fermentation. So this is how we get things like beer, wine, vodka, all sorts of different stuff like that. You're essentially taking these microorganisms like yeast and you're making them go through fermentation. So you're denying them oxygen, and when denied oxygen or in the lack of oxygen, they're going to go through this process called fermentation. So here's what happens. You give them the sugar, right? They kind of go through that glycolysis stage. Well, they actually do go through the glycolysis stage because they produce 2 pyruvic acids, but they never go through the acetyl-CoA formation, they never go to the citric acid cycle, and therefore they never make enough energy to go through the electron transport chain. So they kind of just stop after that. So after the pyruvic acid, they kind of take it and they still release CO2, but in this case, instead of turning it into that acetic acid, those little 2 carbon molecules, they turn it into ethyl alcohol. That's where we get things like beer and bread and stuff like that. So yeast can be great for those kinds of things, but you have to actually deny them oxygen kind of thing. Now, luckily for us, that doesn't happen. And you're like, what do you mean? You mean my body could potentially produce alcohol? Yes, but we would not want that. So imagine back in the day when we're evolving and we're running away from, say, a saber-toothed tiger that's trying to eat us. Well, as your body uses up, as your muscles use up all the available oxygen, if this was the case and we were things like a yeast organism, we would then go through alcoholic fermentation, and running, which would deplete the oxygen in our muscles, would then make us drunk. Not a good way to get away from a saber-toothed tiger that's trying to eat you. So again, would not be good for us. So luckily for us, we don't make ethyl alcohol. We make what's called lactic acid. And these are the things that actually make your muscles sore. So when you're, you've always been told to like stretch after working out and breathe. That's because your body is lacking oxygen, including your cells. So your cells then go to produce, in the same way that alcoholic fermentation happens, lactic acid fermentation happens. You go from the glucose to the pyruvic acid, but in this case, you form lactic acid instead of ethyl alcohol. That's all. But this is what makes our muscles sore, but it's a good thing because we don't want to get drunk and then die because we just got eaten by a lion, right? So yes, we do go through fermentation when we don't have enough oxygen, but we just produce that lactic acid. Too much lactic acid can be a bad thing. Again, that's why they tell you to stretch afterwards and to breathe and all that good stuff. That's because we're trying to replenish that oxygen so you stop producing this lactic acid. Alright guys, so with that we are going to watch a quick crash course video. You know it's your favorite, but really these ones do help so much. They helped me when I was an undergrad studying all this stuff, and it really kind of, some of his jokes even like stick with me, so I remember them because they were really super helpful. So let's pause real quick and let's watch that video. Okay, so I really hope that you guys enjoyed that video. It really does help to solidify that information when you can see the animations. I'm not that creative nor clever that I can actually do those computer-generated animations, so that's why I want to show you these videos, because they really do help. So we're not quite done with, we're close. If this was an in-class assignment, I would actually make you guys, I would trick you and make you think that you're done, but you're not done. It's time for an in-class assignment to test our knowledge on what we just learned from me and from Hank in those crash course videos. So normally this would be a group assignment, but this is going to be individual because you have these videos and you have all the time in the world now. Well, you have a week to do it because this is an at-home, class kind of thing. So what you guys are going to do is you're going to walk your way through the steps of cellular respiration. Remember how I said step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4? There's a reason I repeated those over and over and over again, because you need to write them down. And now you're going to type this up and you're going to submit it on the Canvas site. So you'll see in class number 2 is on cellular respiration. So that is the end of the video. Now that you guys have an additional homework assignment or an in-class assignment to get some points off of, remember the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, where pretty much all cellular respiration is happening except glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm. So thank you so much for sticking with me on this video. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you next week for photosynthesis.